Today's speaker, Joel WolfArth, is someone that most of you know. But for those who are new, Joe has been a member of CUUC for more than 20 years. Joe is a very devoted member of this church and is past president of the CUUC Board of Trustees, vice president, church speaker, and member of the worship committee. Joe is a native of Daytona Beach, and his family here go back for many generations. Joe has a degree in fine arts from a highly esteemed art institution in Chicago. His career has been varied. He has held numerous positions in social services, including being a group home manager in Minneapolis. He currently cares for older adults with disabilities. Joe is an artist, writer, and poet, and might I add, humorist. I am proud to call you my friend, Joe, and very proud to have you deliver a talk on ancient Japanese philosophy and aesthetic called Wabi Sabi.
Thank you, Ms. Laura. I want to start with the spiders. I was terribly arachnophobic as a kid, and only a few years ago, a friend helped me learn a method where you literally tap your pressure points to help overcome phobias. And I have to say, it really worked because I'm not arachnophobic in the way that I was. And this is helpful because over the decades of my life, a friend gifted me with some totem animal medicine cards, which are an oracle card deck, and I naturally drew the spider while drawing my totem animal spread. And my friend told me, usually if you have a phobia about any particular animal, they are a totem animal, which means they have something to teach you spiritually. And then as I investigated the meanings of the spider, I discovered that cultures around the world, in particular Africa, which they say is probably the cradle of human beings, where our species evolved first, cultures around the world, especially in Africa, revere the spider because the spider, as they say, wove the world. And the world and its history are woven through our stories. And as storytellers, we become symbolically the spider, and we reweave and reweave and reweave the spiritual essence of our world, some of us on a consistent and almost daily basis. So lately I've been finding a lot of spiders in my home, and I feel like they're saying, you have to tell the stories. You have to tell your stories. You have to tell the stories of your ancestors. It is on you to be the storyteller. And look at us. Here we are reminding you. So the one that was dangling from my kitchen ceiling fan last night after I turned the light on under the fan, I said, look, I'm sorry, but I can't have you hanging there landing on me while I'm just trying to turn on the light. So I took a kitchen rag and I swept him off of there. And then I saw him going across my floor and I said, I'm sorry, kid, I'm taking your life, Stomp. Yes, that makes me almost as bad as an ICE agent. Merciless, merciless. And the other spider I allowed to live because I just couldn't do it twice. And one evening I had picked up a box that I thought at some point might be useful to put things in. And there was a spider coming out of the box as if to say, what are you doing disturbing my home life? And I said, look, I'm sorry, but I had a use for this box in mind, and you're just going to have to relocate. And I flung the box into the corner of the room. And later, when I went to examine, I saw that there was a whole little spider web inside the box, and there was no spider anymore. And I'm like, well, I hope that you found somewhere else to live, unlike the one I squished, because the box is going. Got to find somewhere better to live, pal. So I've been seeing them a lot in my home lately, and I feel like they're telling me you have to tell your stories and the stories that are relevant. Laura pointed out my family's been in this area for a long time. I like to tell my brother that we are the original Holly Hillbillies because our great-grandparents built a home in Holly Hill on the Halifax in around 1900 and is still standing. My grandmother grew up there. My mother grew up there. And when I was a baby, my parents bought the house next to it so that I could grow up in the same neighborhood, which was our family home since the turn of the 20th century. And because of that, my stories and my family's stories do interweave. And because of that, I also grew up in a place where I was surrounded by the history of my family. And this is relevant to my perception of the meaning of Wabi Sabi, because I looked up Wabi Sabi on the internet. And that's why I turned my phone back on so I can tell you what the internet says exactly is the meaning of Wabi Sabi. Two Japanese words that have a very ancient origin. Hundreds of years ago, during what Europeans would call the Middle Ages, there was a time in Japan when the word wabi came to mean something it hadn't necessarily meant before. It had an inflection of a kind of sadness and loss, a kind of melancholy, a kind of grief. But wabi changed to mean perfect imperfection. And I'm going to give you the quote from the internet. Wabi refers to rustic simplicity, freshness, the quiet elegance of living humbly in harmony with nature. Perfect imperfection, recognizing that the asymmetry in nature has a perfection all of its own. Sabi relates to the beauty that comes with age, wear, and patina, the graceful passage of time. And that connects us to the deeper meaning of time, which is cyclic. Things are born, they blossom into being, they age, they ripen, they decay, they die. Behind our home, we have an ancient oak tree. In fact, I think when the house that I live in, which is the same house that I grew up in, it belongs now to my brother. When the house was built, which was 1886 when they started building our house. And a historian told me that was the year that Henry Flagler brought his railroad as far as Daytona, which he had been working on. The Florida East Coast Railway had come down through Jacksonville to St. Augustine, and the railroad reached Daytona in 1886. I learned this from a local historian who said when the railway got to Daytona, it made it so much easier for people to build houses and larger things like hotels, like the Hotel Ormond, because a lumber yard opened right next to the railway depot. And so if you needed building supplies, you could just go over to the railway depot, and there was this big lumber yard, and lots of houses sprung up in that period of time, including what was the origin of our house, which got added on to later multiple times. So I think what they did, they planted the trees that are around our house, that have always been around our house my entire life, because they wanted those trees to be there to give us shade and to give us comfort and to give us natural beauty. And the one behind our house on the west side of this is one of three enormous old oak trees. Recently, we discovered had completely died. It had looked like it was floundering for some time, and now it's completely dead. And I couldn't wait to tell Debbie Zill, because Debbie Zill has a fondness for dead trees. And I told her, I'm going to have to take some pictures and some video of the beauty of this skeletal tree behind our home. And Debbie said, "Oh yeah, there's nothing like the skeleton of a tree." And I have to say, this oak tree is it's quite grand in its skeleton. It's got an incredible skeleton. And yes, we have been hacking at it because we live in a hurricane zone and we don't want it to fall on the house. And my brother has a plan for taking parts of that tree off piece by piece. And we were working on it this week, as a matter of fact. So we both had the same days off from work, dragging limbs and branches and stuff out to the road. But I'm taking all the photographs I can because there is beauty in this skeletal tree. There's great beauty. And I feel like if the tree could speak, it would say, "I've seen generations," which includes me, "live and grow and age in this house. Here I have stood, I have sheltered, I have shaded, I have protected you from wind, from negativity. I've seen the joys of the human occupants. And in the past few years before it was completely dead, it shed an awful lot of leaves. And we have a kind of a concrete patio behind our home. And man, I was sweeping so many leaves and I kept thinking, what is going on with that tree? I think the tree was dying and it was sending us love letters through the leaves. That tree was speaking its peace as it was making peace with its end. So that to me is kind of a personal experience of Wabi Sabi. My hope is that when our service concludes, those who can stick around will have a conversation and I can ask everybody who's here, what is Wabi Sabi to you? When I first spoke about Wabi Sabi here a few years ago, the thing that immediately came to my mind was my experiences representing our church, which has now happened about 8 times at Unitarian Universalist General Assemblies. And when I go to a Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, I always see a lot of people, a diverse group of people, and there are always a lot of older people, especially older women, who have let their hair go naturally gray. And I always think, Wabi Sabi, because Wabi Sabi tells us that we can accept things in their impermanence, in the temporary state that they're in, because that's just one of the states of being born, being young, being mature, aging, having gray hair. This is all part of that Wabi Sabi cycle of nature. The Sabi part, the part about knowing this is a part of a larger cycle. This tree and other trees will die this year. This person and other people will let their hair go gray or not as they choose. But I always am inspired by the UU ladies with their beautiful gray hair. And I always feel like it's kind of a collective silent Wabi Sabi rising from the crowd at General Assembly. The joy of just being who you are. My grandmother, who grew up in the house next to the one that I grew up in, thanks to my parents, Grandma used to say when she was a little old lady, she lived to be 82, and she decided when she turned 80, someone told her, "Look, you're an old lady now. You can do absolutely anything. And if anyone calls you on it, you can say, 'I can't help it. I'm an old lady. I'm 80, you know.'" And that was really old back in the 1980s when she told this to me. But she also used to say, "You can't see my wrinkles because I'm too fat," which was kind of a cop out. And I did call her on it while I was a teenager and she was still living. I said, "Grandma, studies have shown that your wrinkles tell the story of your life. If you have crow's feet and laugh lines, it means you've laughed and smiled. If you've laughed and smiled, you're wearing the joy of your lifetime on your face." I probably wondered aloud whether her younger sister had the same kind of wrinkles, because I know that my great aunt had a whole lot of, what do they call it, pith and vinegar. She was the more unhappy of the two sisters. And my grandmother's wrinkles absolutely were happy person wrinkles. Crow's feet, laugh lines, things that accumulate from years and decades of living with joy and feeling joy and experiencing joy. So when I think about the things that Wabi Sabi has come to mean and how our culture discovered Wabi Sabi and said, oh, we can take a note from the Japanese culture, they seem to have embraced it. I learned researching a little bit about what I was going to speak on today. Back in that period, the medieval period, the nobility in Japan wanted to show off their wealth and success. And some of the ways they did that was they acquired import goods from China. So they had fine porcelain and they had fine furnishings, and they could deck out their homes and have elaborate tea ceremonies with all this stuff around them under the full moon. And somewhere in 13, 14, 1500, one after another, philosophers started to come along and say, but you know what? We don't need all those trappings. We can have simple stoneware, even pieces that are kind of lopsided or flawed because they were handmade. We can have simple furnishings, like a wooden bench that's been worn down and the place where someone loved always to sit exactly in that bench. We can have textiles that show their wear because they've been worn and loved. We can do our tea ceremony on a night when the moon isn't full or there are clouds in the sky. And it can be just as meaningful because these too are things that happen in the cycle of nature. A decaying branch or a branch from a dead tree can be just as beautiful in a floral arrangement. So the culture of Japan shifted and changed. And the meaning of wabi stopped being something so sad and melancholy and started being something about the perfection that exists in imperfection. And that makes me think of how we learn from other cultures and other peoples. We learned the word Hygge. I think it's from Denmark. It's pronounced hygge, and that means cozy. And I heard that a lot in articles I read a few years ago. And before that, there was Wabi Sabi, which comes from Japan. And around the world, people recognize that the pursuit of perfection, though a charming thing, is really an unwinnable game because it's so much easier to just say, I will accept that the best efforts are still going to provide imperfect results. And I think that's useful coming towards an election season. I've heard it from pundits, from wise people. We're going to do the best we can, and we're not going to strive for perfection, but we're going to find the best options. And that fits. That fits with Wabi Sabi. Let's work with what we have. If we have an old dead tree, what shall we do with it? I'll photograph it. We'll cut it down piece by piece. The house my great-grandparents built is still standing next to the house that I live in again. And a man came along when my cousins who had inherited or were about to inherit the house from my uncle was still living, but he was quite elderly and couldn't be a snowbird anymore. His home was in Alaska. My cousins found a guy to buy the house that my great-grandparents built. This man's name was Paul, and he didn't just, what is the word, renovate an old house, he restored it. He went to a lot of trouble to make it wonderful again. And I was so pleased that my cousins had found this person. Paul was married to a woman from Japan. Her name is Yoko. I could never make this up. I asked them about their children. They have a son named John. This is a real true story. Yoko said the first time she set foot in the house my great-grandparents built, she felt the energy and the vibe, as you would say if you were a Californian, she told me, was so good that she knew this house was a project. They wanted to make this house feel very much alive again and restore it. And Paul told us that when he called a friend and said, come over and look at this old house I'm restoring, his friend came over. And old houses, as my mother explained, because she had been a realtor, here in Florida often have things that our house has and that the house my great-grandparents built later have. They're built up off the ground on supports so that air can come underneath because that helps your house stay cool. And that was very important when we didn't have air conditioning. So Paul's friend told him, are you concerned about the supports under this old house? And Paul said, yes. Should I replace them? should I get the floors leveled? And his friend said, yes, you should replace the supports because they've been there since about 1900 and they're crumbling. They're, they were brick columns where bricks were put together into a column. And the friend said, but don't try to level the floors because this house has been settling for 110 years, which is how old it was then. And if you level out the floors, the joins are going to start cracking and breaking. And you might even have trouble with the plumbing and the electricity because the house has been settling all this time. You need to respect its process of settling. So do replace the supports, but replace them with supports in such a way that they're the same height, because leveling the floors could be a devastating thing in the future. And Paul told us this, and I said, you know, my mom had a realtor's license, and she liked to say to people when showing an old house, drop a marble and see where it rolls. And they would say, oh my gosh, that marble is rolling all around the room. And my mother would say, that's part of the charm of an old house. If you can't stand that a marble's going to roll, maybe this is not the right home for you. And people who live in my great-grandparents' house now have added to it. They put a mother-in-law wing on the back of the house for the husband's wife, the husband and wife's, his mother, to come and live in. They added another bathroom on the second floor so they would have a nicer home. And I told my brother, they're adding to the lifespan of the house our great-grandparents built. We have seen trees that were probably planted around the time that house and before that, our house was built, reached the end of their natural lifespan. We've lost a big oak on what was my great-grandparents' property, and we lost a big magnolia in a hurricane on our property, which literally fell on the house. And my mother would have been happy had she been alive to say, look at that. They don't build houses this well anymore. There was this huge magnolia just leaning on the house. And the house just kind of took it. My brother Jan, who was living at the time in the mother-in-law apartment, which is mine now, he said, I really thought a freight train hit our house during the middle of that hurricane because it was so loud and it was so massive a vibration. It was just that magnolia tree falling. So Wabi Sabi to me has personal meaning because I live in a place where Wabi Sabi is a part of my daily experience. And yes, there are things we need to do. Our picket fence needs replacing because the pickets are literally falling off. And I think that's a step beyond Wabi Sabi. I think that's we need a fence. But something like my light fixture in my bathroom, which has some corrosion, when I cleaned it, I realized it's never going to look like a new light fixture again. So I can demand that my brother help me find another light fixture, or I can say, Wabi Sabi. It's got this kind of Gothic charm with the corrosion on it. Can I be satisfied and leave it alone because it still works? The light comes on every time I turn the switch. Thank you for letting me share some of my stories. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to us having a conversation where I can say, what does Wabi Sabi mean for you? Thank you. I forgot the bowl. This bowl was given to me by cousin Rhonda. It is not ceramic, it's plastic. I said, wow, that bowl has certainly lived. Look how worn it is. And she said, yes, but it's still functional. This bowl is going to be useful for something. Wabi Sabi.